So, Prince William just did something the palace usually never does. He reportedly moved to strip members of Queen Camilla's family of a property arrangement they'd been quietly enjoying for years, and he did it in writing, through official duchy channels, with lawyers standing in the room. And the reason is honestly more personal than anyone expected, because we're not talking about a routine estate review here. We're not talking about a polite reshuffle of who gets which cottage on which corner of which royal holding. We're talking about the future King of England, looking at a specific arrangement tied to his stepmother's relatives, and saying in effect, this ends now. That's not a small internal memo. That's not institutional housekeeping. That's the heir to the throne drawing a line through a name on a lease, and telling the family lawyers to make it official. And when you understand what those lawyers reportedly found buried in the fine print, the whole thing stops looking like a family squabble, and starts looking like something much bigger about how William intends to run the monarchy when it becomes his. Before we get into it, if you're new here on Crown Watch, hit subscribe so you don't miss the updates on this one, because this story is still developing behind palace walls, and the ripple effects are only just starting to reach the surface. Every week we cover the shifts inside the House of Windsor that the official press office would honestly rather you didn't notice, and this one is a textbook example. So let's talk about what actually happened here, because the timeline is pretty revealing when you lay it all out. According to sources familiar with the internal review, the whole thing reportedly began late last year, when William, in his capacity as Duke of Cornwall and steward of the Duchy of Cornwall estate, ordered a full audit of long-standing residential arrangements tied to extended family members of senior royals. A royal audit, for anyone unfamiliar, is essentially a top-to-bottom review of how properties, incomes, and privileges are being distributed across the estate, and it's meant to happen regularly. In practice, palace observers say, some of these arrangements haven't been meaningfully reviewed in decades. I know that sounds incredibly boring, but stay with me because it's actually the key to this entire story. Because when the auditors sat down at Kensington Palace, reportedly on a grey morning in early winter, one of the very first files pulled from the stack was a residence linked to members of the Parker Bowles family, Camilla's extended relatives. The property in question, according to insiders describe, is a substantial home on a duchy-adjacent estate, tucked away from the main tourist routes, quietly maintained at what one aide reportedly called a rate significantly below fair market value. We're talking, according to those briefed on the review, about an arrangement that had been rolling over year after year since the days when Camilla was still Duchess of Cornwall, well before her elevation to Queen. And here's where it gets interesting. The lease itself was reportedly structured in a way that made it almost invisible in the annual accounts, buried under a general maintenance line, rather than listed as a family residency benefit. That's not nothing. That's the kind of accounting choice that only makes sense if someone, at some point, wanted this particular arrangement to stay quiet. The auditors reportedly flagged it at 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday, according to a timestamp on the internal memo one source described. By that afternoon, the file was sitting on the desk of William's principal private secretary. His principal private secretary, for context, is essentially the most senior aide in his household, the person who acts as the gatekeeper between William and the machinery of the monarchy. Nothing sensitive reaches William without passing through that office first. And what that office reportedly told him, in a briefing that lasted less than 20 minutes, was that the arrangement wasn't just generous. It was, in the legal team's phrasing, structurally irregular. That's the detail that changes everything. Now here's where the contradiction starts to emerge between what the palace was projecting publicly and what was actually happening behind closed doors. Because at exactly the same time this audit was underway, Camilla was carrying out a series of high-profile engagements. A royal engagement is an official duty carried out on behalf of the monarchy, everything from ribbon cuttings to state dinners, and Camilla's calendar had been reportedly packed. She was being photographed smiling at literacy charities, standing beside King Charles at investitures, embodying in the palace's preferred phrase, steady service. And honestly, that's hard to argue with. She has, by most accounts, worked hard to earn her place in the public imagination after decades of being cast as the outsider. I understand that instinct too. When you've spent that long being disliked by a significant portion of the country, you don't waste the goodwill. But here's the thing. While Camilla was being celebrated on the front pages, William was reportedly sitting in a private meeting at Kensington Palace, reviewing pages of documents that told a very different story about how her extended family had been treated by the estate. And the two things could not coexist forever. One of them was going to have to give. Sources familiar with William's thinking say he was reportedly torn. On one hand, he genuinely respects the stability Camilla brought to his father's life, and he's said as much, privately, to close aides. On the other hand, he has spent years watching arrangements like this one accumulate under previous reigns, and he reportedly told one senior figure that he refused to inherit a monarchy that looked from the outside like a private welfare system for whoever happened to marry in. And that's where the third party comes in, because this story isn't just about William and Camilla, it's about Charles. Because Charles, palace observers said, was reportedly not informed of the audit's findings until several weeks after William had already made up his mind. That's not standard practice. Under normal protocol, a matter this sensitive, involving the Queen's own relatives, would be flagged to the King's household first, discussed, softened, negotiated. William, according to insiders describe, skipped that step entirely. He reportedly went to the duchy's legal team, asked what the fine print actually permitted him to do, and moved before anyone at Clarence House had a chance to intervene. Clarence House, for those less familiar, is the King's official London residence and the operational heart of Charles's household. It's where these kinds of family flare-ups are traditionally managed quietly, over tea, with soft voices and softer landings. William reportedly bypassed all of it, and I honestly can't stop thinking about the specific gesture one source described from that morning. According to the account, when William was handed the final legal recommendation, he read it once, took off his glasses, placed them on top of the folder, and asked only one question. He reportedly asked whether the arrangement had ever been formally approved by his grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. The lawyer paused. The answer, according to the person in the room, was no. There was no formal letters patent, no signed sovereign authorization, no paper trail leading back to Elizabeth. Letters patent, quickly, are the formal legal instruments the monarch uses to grant titles, rights, and privileges. Their absence in this context is enormous, because it meant the arrangement had been operating for years on what amounted to a soft understanding, not a hard legal right. William reportedly put his glasses back on, closed the folder, and said only that he'd seen enough. That moment changed everything inside that household. Because the second William confirmed that no formal sovereign authorization existed, the entire legal foundation of the Parker Bowles residency arrangement, according to those briefed on the investigation, collapsed. It wasn't that anything illegal had happened. It's that nothing legally binding had ever been established in the first place. And if that's true, then the arrangement wasn't a right at all. It was a favor, a very expensive, very long-running favor. And favors, as any royal historian will tell you, can be withdrawn. The formal notice was reportedly delivered through the duchy's legal office in the following weeks, drafted in careful, unsentimental language. It didn't mention Camilla. It didn't mention Charles. It simply referenced the specific residence, the specific occupants, and the specific timeline for the arrangement to be wound down. According to sources familiar with the document, it gave the family a generous window to make alternative arrangements, and it offered assistance with the transition. This is important, because it tells you something about how William wants to be perceived. He wasn't going to be seen throwing anyone into the street, but he was, unmistakably, taking the house back. Now here's where the tension really escalated, because Camilla, according to palace observers, didn't find out through official channels. She reportedly found out through a phone call from a family member, and the person who described her reaction said she went completely quiet on the line, then asked, very calmly, whether the king had been told. That's a pretty remarkable question from a queen consort, because it tells you her first instinct wasn't to protect the property. It was to protect her husband from the shock. A consort, for context, is the spouse of a reigning monarch, and Camilla has reportedly worked hard to build a partnership with Charles that shields him from institutional turbulence. This was turbulence he hadn't seen coming. The confrontation, when it finally happened, reportedly took place at Clarence House on a quiet Sunday afternoon. According to one account passed through palace observers, William arrived alone, no aides, no security visible in the room, just him and his father in the small sitting room Charles prefers for difficult conversations. The chairs, the source said, were arranged the way they always are, angled slightly toward each other, with a low table between them. There was no tea. That in itself, palace insiders describe, was unusual. Tea is the ritual that lubricates every difficult royal conversation. Its absence meant this was going to be direct. Charles reportedly opened the conversation by asking whether William understood the personal weight of what he'd done. William, according to the account, didn't answer immediately. He reportedly said that he'd read every page of the audit, that he'd consulted the lawyers 3 separate times, and that he wasn't going to run a monarchy that quietly subsidized the extended families of consorts through arrangements the public would never accept if they were made visible. His voice reportedly rose, then stopped. He apparently took a breath and added, more quietly, that this wasn't about Camilla. It was about the pattern. Charles reportedly covered his face for a moment with one hand. And then, according to the source, he asked William whether he had any idea how much Camilla had already given up to hold the family together through everything that had happened over the last 3 years. He mentioned Harry. He mentioned the cancer diagnoses that had reshaped both their lives. He reportedly said that Camilla had been the one holding the household upright when he himself couldn't. And then he said the line that, according to those briefed on what happened next, reframed the entire confrontation. He reportedly told William that Camilla had come to him weeks earlier, before any of this became formal, and asked him to let the arrangement end. That she'd said her family didn't need it, that she was tired of the whispers, and that if William was going to be king one day, he had to be allowed to be king now. That's a pretty remarkable admission from a father to a son. Because it meant Camilla, the woman the public had spent decades assuming was clinging to every advantage the palace could give her, had reportedly been the one asking, quietly, for the advantage to be taken away. William, according to the account, didn't respond right away. He reportedly stood up, walked to the window, and stayed there for what one source called a long, uncomfortable stretch of silence. When he turned around, he apparently said only that he wished he'd known, and Charles reportedly answered that Camilla hadn't wanted him to. And here's where the story stops being about property, and starts being about something much older. Because the version of Camilla the public has carried in their heads for 30 years, the version painted by tabloids and biographies and endless documentary reconstructions, was reportedly not the woman sitting quietly at Clarence House asking for less. She was, according to those closest to the situation, asking for the family to be seen the way she'd spent her later years trying to be seen, as people who served rather than people who took. And William, honestly, hadn't given her the chance to say so. He'd moved first. He'd moved through the lawyers, through the audit, through the duchy. He'd treated it as a governance problem. And it was, in fairness, a governance problem. But it was also, palace observers said, a human one, and he'd handled the human part second. The aftermath moved outward almost immediately. Within days, according to sources familiar with the media strategy, a carefully worded briefing began to circulate to trusted royal correspondents, describing the change as part of a broader modernization of duchy residency arrangements. No names were attached, no addresses were mentioned. But the story leaked anyway, the way these stories always do, and by the following week the headlines were sharp. Some framed William as decisive, a future king finally cleaning up the shadow arrangements that had accumulated across 3 generations. Others framed him as cold, willing to humiliate his stepmother's family to make a point about his own authority. And the public, predictably, split along the lines you'd expect. Older citizens, according to polling one royal commentator described on air, felt William had been too aggressive, that whatever the legal technicality, family didn't do this to family in public. Younger demographics viewed it as long overdue, evidence that the next reign might actually treat the estate like a public trust rather than a private inheritance. And in the middle, as always, sat the people who just wanted the family to stop giving them reasons to argue about it at dinner. There was one small human detail that landed hardest for me. According to a source who spoke to a member of the household staff, Camilla reportedly wrote a handwritten note to William in the days after the confrontation. She didn't send it through official channels. She reportedly left it, folded once, on the small table in the entrance hall at Clarence House, where he'd know to look for it if he came by. The note, according to the person who saw it, was short. It reportedly said she understood. It reportedly said she'd wanted this too. And it reportedly ended with a single line thanking him for doing what Charles couldn't bring himself to do. William, according to the same source, kept the note. He reportedly put it in the same folder that had held the original audit, the one with his glasses on top of it, that morning at Kensington Palace. This action, palace observers said, was taken to protect the institution, not to punish the family. And that framing matters, because the version of this story that will circulate in the tabloids for the next 6 months is going to be the version where William humiliated Camilla and cut her relatives off at the knees. The version the people in the room reportedly saw was very different. It was a future king, working through a legal irregularity his grandmother had never approved, being quietly encouraged by his stepmother to do exactly what he did, while his father sat in a room without tea and tried to explain why the timing hurt anyway. The ripple effects are still moving through the household. According to insiders describe, at least 2 other long-standing arrangements are now under review, unrelated to the Parker Bowles family but flagged by the same audit. The Duchy legal team has reportedly been asked to prepare a full inventory of every residency benefit granted without formal sovereign authorization over the last 40 years. That's not a small piece of work, that's a generational reset of how the estate treats extended family. And if that inventory is ever made public, even in summary form, palace watchers say the reputational shock will not be limited to one family or one queen. There's also the question of Harry, which no one at the palace wants to talk about, but everyone reportedly is. Because if William is willing to withdraw a residency arrangement from Camilla's relatives on the basis that it lacked formal sovereign authorization, the same standard could, in theory, be applied to any number of properties and privileges scattered across the wider family. Sources close to the situation are careful to say no such review is currently underway regarding Harry or Meghan. But the precedent is now sitting on the shelf, and precedents in the House of Windsor have a way of getting pulled down when the moment demands them. What this whole situation illuminates is something I think a lot of us feel about our own families, even if the scale is nothing like this. That there is a difference between what is legal, what is fair, and what is kind, and those 3 things do not always line up. William, in this case, chose legal. He chose the audit, the fine print, the letters patent, the paper trail. And in doing so, he reportedly did something Camilla had been asking for quietly for months. But he did it without asking her. And that gap, between the right action and the right way to take it, is where the whole story lives. Duty and love are not the same instinct. Silence and grace are not the same virtue, and the institution and the people inside it will always be pulling against each other. That's the tension William has inherited. That's the tension he will carry to the throne. And if the folder on his desk, the one with the note from Camilla now tucked inside it, means anything at all, it's that he already knows the job is going to cost him something every time he does it right. Before we wrap up, if you want to stay updated on royal family news as it develops, make sure to subscribe to Crown Watch so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.